and thank you for joining today's webinar, The RevOps Movement, Why Centralizing Marketing, Sales, and Customer Operations is Critical in Today's Environment. My name is Ellen Smoley, and I'm the moderator for today's webinar. Thank you for taking time out of your busy day to tune into a topic that we're really excited about. We really hope that you'll be able to take away some great, insightful information. Really quick, before we get started, I'll cover a few housekeeping tips. We have great resources in the Resources Hub, which you can find in the top right corner, which includes the slides from today's presentation if you want to grab those. We've also enabled group chat in the bottom widget to make the session more interactive and give you a chance to meet your fellow attendees. Lastly, please use the Q&A box. Please fire those questions away, and if we don't have time to get to your questions during the webinar, we'll follow up with you after. Now, I'd like to introduce our great speakers. First, we have Jay Formico. Jay has spent many years developing marketing strategy and revenue operations research and is Iron Horse's Chief Research Officer. And next, we have Sam Melnick. He is the VP of Market Insights and Growth for Allocadia, where he focuses on the intersection of marketing best practices, marketing technology, and marketing processes. Prior to that, he ran Allocadia's marketing team, where they launched a revenue operations function. And before that, he was the lead analyst at IDC's CMO Advisory Service, serving marketing ops and chief marketing professionals at 1 billion plus organizations. Jay, now I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you, Ellen. Here's what we're covering today. We're going to cover what RevOps is, the types of organizational models that support it and those that don't. We're going to talk about how to make the case to transition an organization that is using conventional operational silos toward RevOps, and then a step-by-step process in order to move your organization to RevOps. So as a bit of a cutover, when I think of revenue operations, I think of logistics in the 1950s. And I know that might sound like a stretch, but hear me out on this. So in the 1950s, to get goods from point A to point B, heavily reliant on ships, and specifically heavily reliant upon longshoremen. And these longshoremen would take the goods out of a truck and physically move those boxes, irregular shaped packages, bales of hay and whatever, and put them into the irregularly shaped hulls of the boat. And that was really time intensive. A truck could take up to a day to get unloaded, and then it might take up to a month to get those goods into the ship. And here's the thing. When the ship got to its destination, it then had to get manually unloaded by the longshoremen. It then had to get manually loaded into trains and had to get manually unloaded from the trains and manually loaded into the trucks and then unloaded to their final destination. And I think what you can draw out of this, it was heavily manual. It was really expensive as well. And it wasn't expensive because of the cost of transportation. It was expensive because of the amount of time and effort required to load and unload, to load and unload. And to give you a basis of comparison, a longshoreman charged $5.85 per ton that they loaded into the hull of a ship. And that doesn't sound like much money until when you realize that in 1950, you could buy a brand new car for $1,500. And that you were doing that multiple times. And let's think about this now. Ships are involved, trucks are involved, trains are involved in terms of moving goods from point A from point B. And none of them are standardized. There's no integration between the two of them. And then this happened. One shipping organization moved forward with a standardized shipping container. A shipping container that could be taken off the bed of a truck and put immediately into the hold of a ship. Rather than taking up into a day of unloading the truck, it could now be done in 8 hours. And there wasn't fanfare to be certain. The longshoremen viewed it as a crisis. And the reason they viewed it as a crisis is it really threatened their existence. And no other transportation organization really thought it would take off. It didn't make sense. This isn't how you moved goods from point A to point B. It was successful, though. It drove the cost of shipping from $5.85 per ton down to 16 cents. That was a 95% reduction. Now imagine going into a management meeting with your boss and your boss's boss, and you say, hey, here's one of the most expensive line items that we have in our budget. I found a way to cost effectively and safely reduce it by 95%. That's what we're talking about here. There was significant cost savings. But beyond that, though, ships got out into the port and onto the water faster. Trucks got back onto the roads more rapidly. There were significant optimizations all around. And we all know how the story ends. Shipping containers, they're a way of life for us now. They're the standard for shipping. They're everywhere. Container ships replaced conventional ships. Trucks and freight trains standardized on them too. And as a result, transportation went from expensive to cheap and completely disorganized to heavily standardized. So what does this have to do with RevOps? With RevOps, it's just like how goods were transported in the 1950s. The operations teams of most B2B organizations, they're siloed. There's sales ops, there's marketing ops, there's customer success ops. I'm also putting finance ops here too, though it is really not truly in the definition of RevOps, because especially in like B2B SaaS organizations, it's really difficult to kind of delineate out where the sales stops and where finance picks up. Now, each of these operation teams are responsible for the individual processes that support their organization. So as an example, sales ops, they're focused on territory management, deal management, quote to cash, and forecasting. Each of the operation teams are also responsible for the technology that supports their respective functions. Now, that involves managing the tech stack, but also the data that's within the technologies, within the platforms that they're using, and then driving the metrics and the reporting that they're using to judge daily, weekly, or yearly success, individual, team, or company success. And there's a couple problems with taking this siloed approach. There's misalignment with each of these functions, each of these groups, marketing ops, customer success ops, sales ops, having separate goals and objectives. It's very difficult for them to align in terms of what matters most for the organization. And if they happen to agree on a particular initiative or a particular project, based upon their individual goals, their individual focus areas, quite frankly, their individual compensation plans, it's going to drive and really skew how they manage the project and what they emphasize and what they don't. There's also a lot of complexity involved. And if you read through the lines of what I said, marketing ops focusing on the MarTech stack, sales ops focusing on the sales tech stack, customer success stack, so on and so forth, each of them are focused on their individual silo. There's no one person or one group that actually owns the tech stack for the entire organization. And as a result, process flows and measurement and reporting, they all stitch together, but they stitch together in like a Frankenstein-like way where it works, but it's not as optimal as it could or otherwise should be. There's a lot of confusion that's created from this as well. And what I mean by that is there's really no standard or clear depiction of the truth. So as an example, if you're trying to measure the number of customers that you have, or perhaps customer churn, something that we would view to be a very simple measurement, depending on the platform you're pulling it from, you're going to receive a different answer. And if you think about it, all of the different functions, they don't necessarily have standardization of the data elements between them. And that makes measurement a lot more difficult to do and a lot more complex. And in terms of complexity, there's a time suck element as well, specifically for multi-department projects where there's lack of alignment, lack of systems connection, non-alignment in terms of measurement and reporting. The amount of time it takes to move a multi-department project forward is really expanded. Lots of manual interventions abound. That's the issue with the current pre-shipping container approach as it relates to operations.
Awesome. Thanks, Jay. And thanks for having me here. I'm really excited to share the stage here. So that's a great setup for like what is driving this shift. Jay laid out really kind of the overview, the departments there and some of those challenges there. But this idea of revenue ops, I'm going to come back to this at the end of this slide, but it's a lot of internal work, but the output is external in the sense of a better customer experience. And I'm going to actually, it's kind of like it's a bit of a leading comment because we'll talk about this towards the end of this slide. But let's talk about revenue ops or RevOps as a concept. So not surprisingly, it speaks to operational, so RevOps, and that alignment of sales, marketing, customer success. And then like that operational alignment at its fullest or furthest is when we're centralizing this. And, centralizing is this funny comment where, does everything have to fall underneath one area or not? But at the very least, it's alignment, it's collaboration. So what I'd say is, Jay talked about, the history of shipping. But what's really intriguing when Jay and I talk about this, about revenue ops, is how do we get here? Maybe not 50 years ago or 100 years ago, but if you even think about, 20 years ago, forget revenue operations. Let's talk about marketing operations. I think at that point, Jay and I were both analysts when that started kicking off, and it was the early days. And if you kind of count everything that goes into, operations around marketing, sales, customer success, and you count the technologies, which are so core to what we do around revenue operations, marketing operations, any operations, we're talking about, 300, 400 or less. I think Scott Brinker's infographic was at 150 when it first started, and that's really changed. So now, 20 years later, whatever, 10 years later, I don't think if you look at across marketing operations, sales operations, customer success operations, or revenue operations, any of those functional areas, there's no process that eventually is aided and abided by technology. You even think about operations across each one of those, and you match marketing B2B in particular, marketing operations, marketing automation system, sales operations, CRM, customer success operations, and now you're starting to see those type of technologies like the gain sites, et cetera, come up. So this technology, it's driving this shift. And I think some of the challenges here as operations, whether it's technology, data, process, does create this Jekyll or Hyde, as the slide says here. There's two competing or juxtapositions here for these executives who they need to be focusing on one hand, their departmental responsibilities, particularly when you're customer facing. Sales is at the it's the most finite point here. Like you have a set of sales reps who are interacting on a daily basis with your prospects, with your customers. But marketing and customer success is the exact same way as well. And it's very departmental. It's very much treating this like a GM to a certain extent. That's a very different skill set than that operational skill that is needed to move RevOps or whatever operational department, whatever department you're sitting in. And these VPs or heads of are not always subject matter experts, and not always is probably being kind. Typically, they aren't a subject matter expert. So think of a VP of marketing. Are they an expert in data normalization? Do they know the difference between an API and a web service? Probably not. So this either creates a lack of focus, a lack of knowledge, or just a lack of ability to deliver on those operations. So, that increased complexity with technology and increased sophistication that this all brings it in. But there's also that challenge of how are we experts here? So I talked about at the beginning, that customer, that externally focused too. Well, our business models are changing. Revenue operations is being driven highly by this idea of subscription, SaaS-based. You see companies, either the high-growing technology companies, all SaaS-based. You see traditional on-prem software companies switching to subscription-based. You're even seeing PLG or product-led growth, where we're trying to get more and more automation and digitalization before a contract signed, a relationship starts. And that's creating a need for more operations. And then, of course, when on the other end of the spectrum, we have account-based marketing. That's actually why we started building out revenue ops at Allocadia, because account-based marketing is so core to marketing and sales and customer success. You have to work together. And if your back end, your data, your technology, your processes aren't talking together, well, you're going to be challenged to deliver that.
Sam, as I look at your slide here, I think there's also another notion, or an additional notion, I would say, in terms of like measurement and reporting. If I think of being a marketing executive 10, 15 years ago, really difficult, really challenging to get a seat at that revenue table, right? And if I think of for marketing, but also customer success and sales, this digitization that you're talking about, all this kind of multitude of all these different applications and platforms and processes, data abounds. So executive management's now driving more accountability. They want to get more insight. And what they're asking for, you have the data, the request seems very simple to achieve, but where you have, I would say where most organizations have like a Frankenstein-esque tech stack, because no one's really managing the whole one. A simple request, or a request that seems to be very simple, is actually really challenging. And how do you articulate that a simple request, or what should be a simple request, is going to take multiple days to get back to the head of sales or the head of marketing, head of success, or the CEO?
I think that's a core point. And I also think from like you mentioned, the marketing team, like from a marketing organization and marketing leadership, aligning with your other revenue, with the revenue focused organizations and executives, particularly when they're the ones that are getting the renewals and signing the new deals, that like being on the same page in terms of measurement, and then the technology and the processes on the back end, like that's a competitive advantage for you as an executive to make sure you're in that room, to make sure that you are a team versus just, the guy or gal delivering the leads and making sure that the website runs. So this is what we wanted to explore today. We wanted to understand what is revenue operations, what it's not, what are the key challenges and the benefits along. So, Iron Horse they fielded a survey in the US and the UK targeting individuals in that revenue, marketing, sales, and customer success operations. And we'll take you through this. There's a set of about 200 respondents and $10 million plus businesses. So let's just start here about the different forms of revenue operations. This is not a one-size-fit-all type thing, unsurprisingly. So I'll move through these around what the type of forms we see that marketing, sales, and customer success operations that revenue ops function are. So you see, just to start, non-existent. So, not really where you want to be. This is when there are no operations. Doesn't matter what function you sit in or what organization you sit in. There's just like, for marketing, for instance, maybe there's a marketing generalist who owns a Marketo or Eloqua instance or HubSpot instance, and they're dabbling in it. Or maybe your director of sales is the one that is kind of managing the CRM. Not ideal. Fortunately, we're talking about like 5% or less here, but this is like companies that are typically pretty far behind on the digital transformation as a whole. So next we talk about not aligned. This is where you have these operational teams, but they are literally siloed. Marketing ops does not talk to sales ops. Who does not talk to customer success ops. Again, between these two, we're talking about less than 10% of companies. So not that common, but not aligned is not a good place to be in either. Sure, you have something, but as we discussed on that last slide, on the last few slides, more and more of these revenue-facing organizations have to work together, and this just doesn't set you up here. So next, now we start talking about opportunistically engaged. So are they consciously aligning? Are they rolling under a single leader? No, but this means that these operations organizations, or the functional operations organization, are working together on specific objectives or specific projects, or maybe there's like a spotlight goal. So the teams come together in an ad hoc or an opportunistic basis. So just under 1 out of every 3, so about 30% are here. This is something. It's probably not where you want to sit, but it's better than those first 2. It means that there is potential, I'd say. Next is where you're aligned. So aligned, let's be clear, that means that the teams are they're not in the same organization. There's not necessarily a central RevOps organization, but it means that they're meeting on a regular cadence to plan, to work. Maybe they have backlogs that they're working together. This could be a weekly, monthly meeting. It could be a stand-up type thing. It could be specific projects. So think about it around when marketing ops and sales ops come together to make sure the lead flow is working between marketing automation and the CRM, and they have a standing meeting around that. So this is, again, 1 out of just under 30% here. So between these 2, we're talking about 6 out of 10, 3 out of 5 companies are at this point either opportunistically engaged or aligned, so purposefully engaged, I'd almost say. Now we've got partially centralized. So this is meaning that some of the operations roles are centralized. So it could be sales ops and marketing ops sit under one function, or maybe there's a sales leader who owns renewals as well. So sales ops also covers customer success operations, but then marketing operations is elsewhere. They're probably going to be aligned with, call it marketing operations, or those that aren't fully centralized. But again, you're sharing the operational function, but it's not all under one leader, which that final one is centralized when there truly is a revenue operations organization where all operations members roll up into that one function, not necessarily into those departments they support.
Question for you here, Sam.
Go for it.
I see you sneakily left out revenue size here. So the organizations that are doing this centralized revenue ops all in one function, what's the over under here? Is that more likely for like a $1 billion plus organization that's super complex, or like a $25, $50 million kind of emerging growth, high flying company?
Yeah. So very, very, very rarely those billion plus organizations. And it's not that the intention isn't there. You often see them sitting in that 30% aligned. Some of the strongest kind of revenue ops functions do sit in those large organizations because they're actively working together. But really where you see that is those higher growth, pre-IPO, VC-backed SaaS technology companies. Some of it is business model. It's in their DNA to align marketing and sales, and like build up those functions. Some of it is just an ability to do that in a move faster. And some of it is, it's just early adopter types, and it's in their blood to a certain extent. So would you agree with that? Is that what you're seeing as well?
I would definitely agree with you on that. And then I'd say like on that, those organizations that are non-existent, those are those are smaller organizations. The vast majority, under 5 million. I was kind of chuckling as you were going through the slide at not aligned. So this was way back in my career, probably maybe 15 years ago or so. I went off on vacation, and at that point, I owned marketing operations, digital marketing for the software company I worked for. $80 million organization. And when I came back from vacation, I found out the sales organization bought a new CRM system. And Sam, it was amazing because at that point we were an early adopter of Salesforce.com, and the head of sales operations made the strategic decision that they had to go to Siebel on demand. Well, outside of that, yes, Sam, but outside of that though, it was kind of a complete disregard that this potentially might impact lead flow. This might impact measurement and reporting. It might impact what marketing's strategic plan was for the next 2 quarters. And by the way, it significantly did. So sales was able to drive forward with a system change, which optimized their aspect of the business, but it didn't just sub-optimize the marketing side. It fundamentally crippled marketing for a period of several months.
Yeah, and that's the supply chain. I'll give you another example, and like this is a danger of opportunistically engaged because I feel like this is where this organization sat. We actually had marketing operations change the attribution in Marketo and Salesforce so that they could report back what they thought should be the attribution model, but sales didn't necessarily agree. So then the reporting would go to the executive team, call it on a weekly, monthly, quarterly basis, and marketing would present it. Here's the world of, source pipeline. And sales would be like, no, I don't agree. So like, sure, you can be, but at other times, the sales ops and marketing ops team would work together, pretty well. But like, you can't be opportunistically because really you start slipping into that not aligned. And then it's just, you don't want to be in those conversations. So let's talk a little bit about what centralization means about alignment. So we actually, or the Einhorst team actually asked respondents to rate themselves 1 through 10. So how strongly they believe marketing and sales systems, processes, and reporting were aligned, 10 being really aligned, and then plotted them using these groups. So let's actually look at that slide here. And I'm going to build this out. I don't think anything's too surprising here. I'm going to call out a couple of things. You can kind of look at it. So you can see on the left side, you agree, these systems are aligned, the processes, et cetera. That's the green, and the red is not. It means they're not aligned. So I think there's something key when I look at this. Nobody's surprised here. The more centralized, the more aligned those systems processes are. But when you look at that not aligned and opportunistically engaged, I was kind of hinting at this in that story. Like, yeah, you're slightly more aligned when you're opportunistically engaged. There's a little less red there, but it really doesn't it doesn't look very good to be in either one of those camps. And, sometimes projects will work together. It will come together when you're opportunistically engaged, but more often than not, you can see more than 50% of that is red. But then you look at the centralized, which is, it's the most aligned with systems, processes, reporting. But it's not like this huge gain. You're not seeing like 3/4 of that bar being green. What you're seeing is slightly better than that aligned and partially centralized. So it's kind of like people sit here and it's like, how do we ever do revenue ops to a certain rate? And it's like, well, start with aligning the organizations because you can make huge gains there. You don't necessarily have to have, and we'll talk about this later, this centralized function. I think you can make greater, faster gains under the centralized function, but just having a loose revenue operations function that's aligned or even partially centralized will, it will bring you forward. It will. The other point here that I want to make is sometimes you move between these. I kind of talked about opportunistically engaged versus not aligned and how you can kind of shift back and forth. Well, sometimes you will want to centralize for, a year, 2 years to put in the processes, to align, to connect this, integrate the systems, to really get those muscles flowing. But then you want to maybe decentralize slightly so that those teams can work at let's call it a larger organization, work more closely with the field or the product lines, the business units to bring best practices there. And that might not be practical in a totally centralized organization. And as long as you keep the kind of, gains that you've made during that centralized period, decentralizing a bit doesn't necessarily have to be painful.
Thank you, Sam. So,
my pleasure.
As research analysts, Sam and I have the opportunity of talking with heads of marketing, heads of sales on a weekly basis. And we had the opportunity of speaking with a large number of them as related to revenue operations. And what's interesting is as we spoke with them, there was a commonality, kind of like looking at the tea leaves. All of them tended to cite the same benefits, whether they were considering rolling out revenue operations or they were an organization that had in fact rolled RevOps out. They spoke about having a shared vision in terms of the goals and priorities that the entire organization needed to drive against, for customer success, for marketing, and for sales. There was a very large focus in terms of measurement and reporting, that whole notion of a single source of the truth or aligned KPIs and metrics that directly went back and tied into the operational objectives that the organization as a whole was attempting to move forward with. There's this whole technology angle too. And this is the fact that when organizations, operation teams are focused on individual silos, you have these little mini fiefdoms and no one really owns the entire tech stack or the revenue driving functions. You have more of that Frankenstein-esque issue, and revenue ops is a way to alleviate that. There's also a whole notion in terms of unified management of key processes and procedures. And what that's saying is, as an example, lead management, you can very clearly see how marketing is involved. You definitely know that sales is involved. We know for a fact that customer success is involved. Can we make sure that everything is smoothly going flowing back and forth between the organizations and departments and the individuals that comprise them, rather than doing so in a more ad hoc, slightly clunky way? And on the operational side, there's this notion in terms of doing more with less. There's the notion of increased responsiveness, especially on projects that are involving multiple departments, or the operational teams in multiple departments. And then a thought in terms of that there's likely going to be decreased errors and decreased omissions, especially for those processes and procedures that span organizations. There's going to be a deeper focus in terms of making sure that the field-based values are flowing between the systems and flowing properly between the systems. So these are the 10 most cited values that we hear from a RevOps perspective. Here's the interesting thing, though. When we actually drill into organizations that have rolled RevOps out, there's a bit of a difference between perception versus the reality of. There's a very large focus in terms of shared operational objectives and priorities. That's the bellwether of RevOps. That's the number one thing it's going to drive for your organization. And I'm going to pause here for a second, because Sam, you do a lot of stuff as it relates to planning and budgeting. That's kind of what like Allocadia does. What do you think about that in terms of a RevOps function and how that impacts it?
Yeah, I mean, I think you start with you need the more shared goals or objectives that you can create, and the more ways that you can connect them. I mean, you don't want to create a freaking spider web, but you want to connect these across the departments. So certainly think about Allocadia or the marketing organization. What are those organizational goals? What are the marketing goals, and how do those roll up, and how are you supporting them with the dollars? Similarly, what are the shared objectives between sales and marketing? What are the shared organizations between sales, marketing, and customer success? And how do you create those connection points? And this is a great way, the operational, the back end of it. I mean, I can even speak to at Allocadia. That was one of the strongest drivers as we switched marketing to being comped to sales accepted leads and pipeline from MQLs. And part of the way to get there was to create shared goals. And then you have to create an operational team that is at least aligned, if not centralized, to support that, because otherwise it's inefficient resources. So.
Measurement and reporting, that is very much, I will call it the second key area that actually drives benefit from RevOps. And what this gets to is, if you think of those, and you've heard me say it a few times, those pesky things, field-based values. Well, in order to do true end-to-end reporting, we want to make sure that there's alignment of those field-based values across the multitude of marketing technologies that you're using, sales technologies, customer success technologies, so on and so forth. And the actual reality is the vast majority of B2B organizations, quite frankly, the vast majority of any organization doesn't have that. And RevOps drives that. RevOps also helps in terms of the aligned metrics and KPIs, and not necessarily just aligning to customer growth or retention or churn is a key thing we're going to focus on, that's easy to do. What's more difficult to do is actually ensuring that every single group, every single department, every single person is measuring it in the same exact way. And the reality is that that actually isn't the case in the vast majority of organizations. And the reality is, depending on the platform or the system you're pulling that report from, realistically, you will have a slightly different number. And that makes it really difficult in terms of management conversations that you're having, especially management conversations where there's executives from different groups having to align on what the strategic organization or what the strategic objective for the organization is. Sam, I see you nodding your head there a little bit.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a key point too, like even just unpacking it a bit. You can kind of be aligned on technology, but there's the approach, there's the process, there's the how are you training your organizations to make sure that it all fits under there. Like, you know, there's aspects here that are almost like you can't piecemeal this. It all has to come together, and there all has to be agreement and nodding heads. And I think that's kind of when you talk about alignment within these groups, you know, centralization forces that. If you can't get good alignment from decentralized ops and generally leadership.
And then we have cost reduction and decreased errors and defects. If that's the primary thing you're trying to drive at RevOps or with RevOps, you should probably go somewhere else. You should probably consider something else, because though it will drive benefit, it drives significantly less benefit than aligned vision, measurement, and things of that nature, at least according to the organizations that have in fact rolled out a RevOps function. Now, what they do say in relationship to that is, yeah, your costs don't get reduced, but you get more value for your dollar. You get more value for your budget based upon that aligned measurement, based upon the shared vision, based upon a more integrated tech stack. So I'm going to make the assumption that you've bought into the notion of RevOps, that you want to move RevOps forward in your organization. And if I move forward with that perspective, let me share with you the most commonly cited obstacles as it relates to establishing a RevOps function. Right? They come into three main buckets. There's political. There's the people in my organization view the number of staff they have under management as being akin to the level of authority they have in the organization, and they don't want to lose authority. And there's also this whole notion of lack of executive support and executive buy-in. And what that's all about, it's a bit of the Dr. Jekyll, Mr. Hyde that Sam referenced, where, you know, I understand what you're trying to do, but I don't actually have a firm grasp of the operational back ends of my department or of my group. There's also the whole notion of, you know, especially in emerging growth organizations, there's so many priorities that I have to prioritize and focus on. I don't actually think that this is a priority. I agree it's something that we should do. It's something that we should do, and we should perhaps reevaluate next year. How do you get around that? There's the uncertainty, which is, hey, this makes sense, but operations isn't viewed as strategic in my organization. It's viewed as a cost center. It's viewed tactically. There's this lack of guidance in terms of, all right, this makes sense, but how do I actually go forward in terms of scaffolding or building a revenue ops function? What do I do first? What do I do second? What do I not do at all? Where are the potential pitfalls? And there's how do you actually articulate the value of it? I can articulate the narrative. I can articulate the mindset and the orientation and what I believe it can and should do for my organization. But how do I actually put a numeric dollar amount to that? And how do I measure against that to prove the success the functions had, or the tighter alignment between my functions and what that drove? And then there's partnership. There's a concern in terms of the goals that each department currently has customer success ops, sales ops, marketing ops, and how to kind of rationalize that, how to kind of pull them all in so they align. And though as a leader, I can definitely say I want to have aligned goals across my organization. The subtext of that is, in order to have aligned goals, I likely have to drop one or two of the goals I'm currently moving forward with. I have to give, I have to lose a bit in order to get the value. And then there's like the lack of partnership between the teams. Right now, perhaps my functions aren't aligned tightly, or perhaps they're just more opportunistic. How can we kind of start bringing them together so they're more tightly coupled? There's also a last one, and I'll call it the special snowflake. And if you actually hear how people describe those special snowflakes, and what I mean by special snowflake is this is unique to my organization. Almost 90% of the time, they're political in nature. It's who's going to actually drive, steer, or manage this whole RevOps function, or drive the alignment, or it's, shoot, I have to work with Sam. Sam, his personality is such where it's just this caustic environment, and you see where I'm going with it. That's what I mean by political in nature. It's not about the manifestation of operations. It's more in terms of the people that actually would drive the operations for your organization. All right. So we talked about perceived, or if I think about these obstacles, lack of authority or functional leaders not wanting to lose control, that's actually less of an issue according to the organizations that have rolled out a centralized RevOps function versus those that are in the planning stages. And the reason for that is being able to articulate the value for the organization, the value for having alignment and what that can do for their individual KPIs, the KPIs for the organization, and the whole notion of a rising tide rises all ships, going back to the metaphor earlier. Lack of collaboration between departments is also more of a perceived issue versus an issue in reality. The lack of collaboration is often driven based upon being provided or being asked to move forward with different goals and different objectives. That has the likelihood or has the tendency of pulling them away versus pulling them together or pushing them together in terms of value for the organization. And then, lack of shared goals between the departments. Again, less of a perceived, more of a perceived issue versus a real issue for the companies. So what's actual? Guidance. There's relatively little written. Well, there's a lot written on revenue operations. There's little written in terms of how to first start out, how to move forward, how to build the business case, and how to do it from a playbook perspective. You know what? Let me pause here for a second. I'm going to put Sam on the spot. Sam, in terms of trying to get guidance in terms of how to build a RevOps team, is there anything that you'd recommend for a marketing, a customer success, a sales leader to do?
Yeah, I think at this point it's very much peer network. There is some research out there and kind of best practice guides, but we're at the point where it's finding peers who have done it or tried it and it hasn't worked, and finding organizations that are of similar kind of size. It doesn't have to be a perfect match, but find those people, ask your network. We all have networks, and talk to those ops pros who have been part of this. Talk to people who, even better, talk to those who have failed, as I said, and kind of take those learnings. And I think it's also going to be, it's not like you have the kind of the uniqueness, the snowflakes. So every organization is different. So you kind of have to adjust it to your organization, but there's core principles that are going to be consistent no matter. So don't forget that. And like, you are special, but you're probably not that special. Sorry.
On value definition, that's a real thing as well. And I think that goes back to what Sam was talking about, the value of networking. Don't try to convince, if you're the head of marketing ops and you're trying to convince your peer in sales operations, don't try to do that. Go through your network, find someone that's in an organization that rolled out RevOps. Get the sales ops leader from that organization to have a peer-to-peer conversation with your head of sales operations, or your customer success operations leader. Have them have that conversation with the customer success operations leader from an organization that moved forward with revenue operations. There's a lot of value in terms of the camaraderie, in terms of being able to articulate the value that was created, their journey, and to Sam's point, what they did right and they would definitely do again, and what they did incorrectly and what they would do if they had to do it a second time around. There's a lot of value in terms of, I don't want to call them worst practices or bad practices, but not everything, unfortunately, is successful, and we can learn from those missteps. And then I know we said lack of goals was a perceived issue. And the reason it's perceived is what we teased out is it really comes down to executive involvement. If senior leadership is very much behind revenue operations, they can very much drive what the organization's goals and priorities in fact are, and how those break out across marketing ops, sales ops, customer success ops, finance ops, and how they should be prioritized. It really comes down to the leader or the driver of revenue operations for your organization. We're going to touch upon that in the upcoming slides.
Yeah. So even talking about, so like we've gotten through 45 minutes of this presentation. We haven't really talked about like what actually chief revenue officer, we kind of hinted at it some. We're talking about revenue operations, but when Jay and I talked about this and when the survey was built out, really how we're looking at this is a single executive who leads the revenue generating functions. And we tossed in maintaining as well, because there's renewals as well. So think about marketing, sales, success. Those are the folks who are touching or are influencing revenue. So this isn't, a shot on sales leaders who have that CRO title. That's a very, very, successful sales leaders are some of the most talented and, hardest to find executives. But just owning sales isn't something that we would consider the chief revenue officer as we looked at this survey. So let's just walk through some truths. Just, a CRO might not be practical in the organization. Maybe it's business model. Maybe it's maturity. Maybe it's just the talent that is there. It's hard to find an executive who can lead all three of those functions. So that's fine. It's the intention here. If you go back to that last slide about what are the key blockers, it's, think about this slide here. I'll build it out. Like, here are the obstacles. How do you overcome those obstacles? Does it have to take a single leader? Probably not. Next, here's a fact. Like, half to 2/3 of organizations don't have a CR, depending on how you're defining it, depending on the question you ask. And even if they have one in title, they are not the majority. They're less than the majority. And I'd even say, I'd probably say we're closer to 2/3 to 3/4 of organizations don't have a CRO. When you get outside of like software as a service, there's very few, in B2B, there's very few true CROs. So again, if you don't have a CRO, that's okay. And it's also not a reason to force fit that either, because it's fiction, You cannot launch a revenue ops function without a true CRO. We just talked about the different levels that aligned, partially centralized and totally centralized. So this is how we look at the chief revenue officer role, but it shouldn't stop you from, if you don't have one, from actually rolling out RevOps as a function. Go ahead, Jay.
Let me hit the nail on the head here. If you have a chief revenue officer, a real chief revenue officer, that's where revenue operations should roll into.
Yes.
100%.
There you go. And that is, I'd say that is a reason to think about, like, if you cannot get the functions aligned, maybe it's time for a functional head, and part of their charter is operations to make sure marketing, sales, customer success starts working in tandem.
So here's a question though. If I don't have a real chief revenue officer in my organization, you're saying it's fiction. I can still launch a RevOps function without a true CRO. All right. Let's say I'm going to go and the vision of my organization is I want to have a centralized RevOps function. Where does that group report into?
Well, I would say if you truly want the centralized model, the first place you do is, should we have a CRO? But that's where you could have an operations function that reports into the COO. That's an option. I don't love that one. You can do finance as well. The other is that you could have one of the functional leaders own revenue ops with dotted lines elsewhere. None of those are honestly something that I love as answers, but they can work depending on the organization. The challenge when they sit outside, like to a COO or finance, is they're not aligned to those goals. They're not aligned to revenue goals. Sure, they want it to grow, but that's not their day in, day out. When it reports into a single leader and there's dotted lines, ultimately that single leader, as altruistic as they are, what they need is going to come first, whether they mean to or not. So that's kind of how I see it.
Yeah, if you don't have that CRO, it's kind of like that conversation of like, Sam, where should inside sales sit? Should it sit in sales or should it sit in marketing? And it's kind of like a pendulum that keeps going back and forth. And like if I think of RevOps and let's say you don't have a chief revenue officer, I don't think there's a right answer. Let me say it more directly. There is not a right answer in terms of the function it should go into. Should it be like the head of marketing or head of sales or customer success or the COO? I think it comes down to I think it comes down to a person level. The personality and the mindset of that individual, and being able to balance the needs, wants, and requirements of sales relative to success, relative to marketing, and as best as possible, do so in a way that minimizes their level of bias. And when they have to push off one of those groups' needs, wants, or requirements, one of their priorities, being able to do so in I don't want to say a structured way, but being able to articulate, I understand that it's a need for your organization. I have to phase it out. Here's why we're phasing it out. Here's what we're doing instead. Here's why. And being able to do so in a way where they maintain that level of respect both ways across all the different groups. And that's difficult to do.
It is. And I think actually this next slide will kind of talk about some of these kind of steps to overcome it. So that's a great lead in. So we'll make sure we zip through next couple slides so we can answer a couple of questions. But when you think about this, like if RevOps is a 4-letter word, if it's not happening, there's no way to have that CRO, let's look at this. So organizationally, trying to build this out quickly. So the integrated team. So that's kind of one, forcing those together, bringing them together under the CRO. But if it's not there, like this idea of a review board, making sure that there's key stakeholders around bringing those operations functions and the executives together to make those decisions on technology, make those decisions on processes, go through that and put the kind of, put the structure and gating factors in place to force that alignment. And force comes off as aggressive, but sometimes you have to put that structure in place. And then planning, like, great, if it's under a CRO, great. If not, marketing ops, sales ops, customer success ops, essentially your ops function should come together for their own planning function as well. I got a customer who says that they try and align, and marketing ops, try and align with sales ops as they're doing annual planning so that they're aligning on growth targets. And like, it's not easy to do, but it just makes life easier so that you're not surprised by the sales targets and the quotas that are coming out. And you understand where you're putting your marketing dollars and people to drive growth for the business. So next is that technical and like that shared reporting, those shared goals. Jay, we've talked about that a couple of times. That's a huge one. Nothing better than putting a shared goal to make people work together. Data standards, like I think this fits well with the review board. You can't have different taxonomy or fields in your marketing automation than your CRM. So we got to be on the same page for that. And then data flow. How is the data flowing? How often is? What are the SLAs? All of these things will help you get aligned, whether you have that centralized function or not. So that's kind of as we look at that, like some steps to take. So Jay, why don't you give us our takeaways, and then maybe we got time for a question or two.
All right, that is Sam pushing me along here. Everyone talks about alignment between sales and marketing and customer success, and calling a spade. You can talk alignment every single day, every single hour, but if your operations aren't aligned, alignment's not going to happen. And it really goes back to what Sam was talking about, like with account-based marketing. Great strategy, but if you don't have end-to-end process flows, that strategy is going to be really painful to drive forward with. With centralization, the more centralized your operation teams are, the more value that's going to be driven out of your operations. By no means should you not be aligned or opportunistically aligned. You should never be those. You really need to make sure that you're at least having weekly conversations across the different operations teams. You should never be surprised when the sales team is buying a new CRM system. And if you don't have a revenue ops function right now, don't try to boil the ocean, boil a pot of water. Start with incremental steps, those steps that Sam just brought out on the last slide. Where he's talking about forces, one of the things that I used to do is I have my marketing operations team. I'd have a member of them sit in the sales ops function once a week. And I'd have someone sit in inside sales once a week and in IT once a week, because that level of closeness drove camaraderie. Now, I know we can't do that in these COVID times, but we can do things like that. And then the last part is be inquisitive. So when you're reading things about revenue operations, keep in mind that it's still an emerging function. It's still an emerging concept. Take that into consideration. And then when you're looking at analyst reports, when you're looking at best practices, when you're looking at guidebooks and playbooks, take into consideration how this would be modified for your organization. So think about breaking it out by company size, by deal type, by type of offering, because that fundamentally will change and does change how you can and how you should roll out RevOps at your organization. And with that, let's see what we have for questions.
Perfect. Thank you, Jay and Sam. We did get a few questions. I think we probably have time to answer 2 or 3. So what the first one we have is, does RevOps work outside of software?
Does it work outside of software? Yes, it drives the same value. I think what you're really what I think that question's really gravitating toward is the frequency of which we see RevOps. I personally see it heavily in software, B2B SaaS software, B2B SaaS software in organizations under $200 million in revenue.
Yep, I agree with that. I think it's where it sits today, but it doesn't mean it can't be done. And I think think about the atmosphere or the organization as a whole, and whether it's possible or not. It doesn't necessarily have to be SaaS versus not. It's more organization specific. It can be. It's just not where it often shows up today, is what I'd say.
Perfect. Thank you. All right. Our next question here is, what is the split between tech, process, and data in RevOps?
Can I say it depends? So I'd say, the split between tech, process, and data. So when I think about that one is, it is kind of cyclical. We start with process. We move quickly to what data do we want from said process, and then we move to what technology will provide the data and make our processes more efficient and effective. I would say probably want to spend less time on implementing tech. You want to get those in, you want to get them implemented, and then you want to work on the process and the data and the maintenance and the fine tuning of the technology. So I don't know about specific splits, but the least amount of time you can spend on the implementation and selection of tech, the more time you can spend on the processes, which improve efficiency in your organization, and the data, which improve effectiveness, help you make better decisions.
I think there's also the impact of like organizational size as well. So just kind of that notion of like scale, Sam, where it's like, if you're a smaller organization, by definition, you're probably spending a little bit more time on tech than you are if you're mid-sized, definitely more than if you're a large organization, just because of the ability to scale that piece of technology or that platform across the organization.
I think that's a great point. Like, even if you break in marketing ops, for both of us have spent a lot of time working and researching. At a smaller organization, you're like the marketing ops person is a jack of all trades, and a lot of that time is spent in tech and data. But then at large $1 billion plus organizations, they have people who don't touch technology at all. They are just the process and marketing enablement people. So that scale is a big portion, but it is a bit of economies of scale.
Perfect. Thank you for answering that. Unfortunately, we are out of time, but wanted to thank Sam and Jay so much for your time and knowledge on this topic. Thank you all for joining us today. If we didn't get to your question, we will follow up with you soon. We really thank you for your time, and we hope to see you back here soon. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you so much, everyone.